I thought my father died poor, forgotten, just another name carved into cold stone. But the moment I stepped into the cemetery that morning, something felt wrong. The air too still, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. And then I saw them. 10 men in black suits standing in a perfect circle around his tombstone. Not talking, not moving, just watching the ground like it meant something more than a grave. And my heart started to pound so loud I could hear it in my ears. Each step I took crunching against the gravel path like I was breaking a rule I didn't understand. I tightened my grip on the cheap bouquet I'd picked up from a gas station 5 miles back, embarrassed suddenly by how small it looked, how ordinary, compared to whatever this was. Because these men weren't family, they weren't friends, they weren't anyone I had ever seen at any funeral I'd been to. They stood too straight, too precise, like soldiers without uniforms. And when one of them finally turned his head slightly, just enough to notice me, the entire circle shifted, not dramatically, just a subtle awareness that made my skin prickle, like I had stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. I should have walked away. I know I should have. But something pulled me forward, something that felt like my father's name calling me back. And then I noticed the tombstone itself, something I had never paid attention to before. The engraving wasn't as simple as I remembered. The name was there, but the middle initial was different. Or maybe I had never really looked closely. Maybe I had just accepted the story I'd been told. Mechanic, quiet man, worked long hours, died too young. That was all I knew. All I thought I needed to know. Until today. Until this moment where 10 strangers treated his grave like it held a secret instead of a memory. I stopped about 10 feet away, my breath catching as one of them stepped aside, just enough to open a path. And that's when I saw him. Not at first. Not fully. Just the edge of a polished black shoe appearing at the base of the headstone. Then the slow shift of a figure rising into view. Tall, composed, dressed like the others, but somehow completely different, like the air bent around him instead of through him. My pulse stumbled, my fingers tightening around the flowers until the plastic crinkled loudly in the silence. He didn't look surprised to see me. Not even a little. If anything, he looked like he had been waiting. And that realization hit harder than anything else, because no one should have been waiting for me here. Not at my father's grave. Not in a place that was supposed to belong only to the past. His eyes met mine and held them. Steady, unflinching, the kind of gaze that didn't ask permission, didn't look away, didn't soften. And I felt something inside me shift, something small but important, like the version of my life I thought I understood was starting to crack. You came late, he said, his voice calm, controlled, not loud but carrying in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And for a second, I couldn't even respond because my brain was still trying to catch up to what was happening. Who he was, why he was here, why these men were standing like statues around my father's grave. I think you have the wrong person. I managed finally, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. My father didn't know people like you. And even as I said it, it sounded wrong. Like I was trying to convince myself more than him. Because something in his expression told me he knew exactly who my father was. Maybe better than I ever had. He didn't argue, didn't react the way most people would if you challenged them. Instead, he simply reached into his coat and pulled out something small, something metallic that caught the pale morning light. And he placed it gently on top of the tombstone, right above my father's name. My eyes dropped to it without thinking, drawn in by instinct, and my breath hitched when I saw it clearly. A worn lighter, scratched along the edges. Initials engraved on the side in a way that felt painfully familiar. I had seen that before, I knew I had, but my mind couldn't place it. Not yet, not fast enough. He kept this on him the night he saved my life. The man said quietly, and the words landed heavier than they should have. Heavier than anything I was ready to process. Saved his life. My father, the man who could barely fix a leaking sink without cursing under his breath. The man who fell asleep on the couch with the TV still on. The man who never talked about anything beyond bills and work and whether I had eaten enough. That man, saving someone like this. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. No, I said, shaking my head before I even realized I was doing it. You're wrong. He was just... I stopped, the word catching in my throat, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. Just what? Just ordinary, just invisible, just mine. The The man in front of me watched that hesitation happen, watched the doubt creep in, and something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Not satisfaction, not exactly, but recognition, like he had seen this moment before, like he knew exactly how it would unfold. And then, from somewhere beyond the circle, I heard it, the low rumble of an engine. Subtle but wrong in the stillness of the cemetery, my head turned instinctively, catching a glimpse of a dark car pulling to a slow stop at the edge of the path. The air shifted instantly, the men around us straightening even more. If that was possible, their attention snapping outward, alert, controlled, ready, and before I could even process what that meant, the man stepped closer, closing the distance between us in a way that felt both protective and overwhelming, his hand hovering near my arm, but not touching, like he was choosing restraint. "Stay close," he said. Softer now, but more urgent, and I felt my heart slam against my ribs because nothing about this was normal anymore. Nothing about this was safe in the way I understood safety. My father's grave behind him, the lighter resting on the stone, the men in black forming a barrier I didn't ask for, and this stranger standing between me and something I couldn't see yet. "You don't know who your father really was," he added, his voice dropping just enough to feel personal, like it was meant only for me. And I swallowed hard, my eyes flicking from him to the tombstone and back again, the question rising whether I wanted it to or not. Who was he, really? The engine sound grew louder, not aggressive but deliberate, like whoever was inside that car knew exactly where they were and why, and I felt my chest tighten as every man in black subtly adjusted their stance, their movements small but precise, creating a wall without making it obvious. And I realized then this was not just a visit, not just some strange tribute to my father. This was something structured, something controlled, something that operated on rules I did not understand. "What is going on?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. Of course he did, his attention never leaving the direction of the approaching car, his presence steady in a way that made everything else feel unstable. "A conversation you were never supposed to be part of," he said quietly, and something in his tone made my stomach drop. Not fear exactly, but the sense that I had stepped into a story long before I arrived, and now I was being pulled into the middle of it whether I wanted to or not. I glanced down again at the lighter resting on the tombstone, the initials catching the light, and suddenly a memory surfaced, faint but undeniable. I was maybe 10 years old, sitting on the floor of our small living room, watching my father turn that same lighter over in his hands, his face distant in a way I had not understood back then. He had snapped it shut quickly when he noticed me looking, told me it was nothing, just an old thing he forgot to throw away, and I believed him because I always believed him, because he was just my father, not a man with secrets worth hiding. Except now. That lie felt too convenient, too easy, like a piece of a puzzle I had never tried to solve. "You knew him," I said, my voice stronger this time, pushing past the confusion. "You actually knew him." And for the first time, the man beside me shifted his gaze fully back to me. And there it was again, that look, not surprise, not hesitation, just certainty, like he had been waiting for me to ask the right question. I owed him more than I could ever repay. He answered, and the words settled between us with a weight that felt impossible to measure. Owed him, not gratitude, not respect, something deeper, something binding, and before I could respond, the car door opened, the sound sharp against the quiet of the cemetery, and my attention snapped back to the edge of the path, another figure stepping out, dressed just as precisely, just as controlled, but different in a way I could not explain, like the air shifted again, but this time in the opposite direction, and I felt it immediately, the tension tightening, the silence becoming something else entirely, something watchful. "You should not be here," the man next to me murmured under his breath, not to me, but not entirely away from me either. And I realized then that whatever this was, it was not finished, not even close. I took a step back without thinking, my heel catching slightly on the uneven ground, and his hand moved then, finally, not grabbing, not forcing, just steadying, a light touch at my elbow that sent a strange sense of reassurance through me, like he was anchoring me in a moment that was quickly slipping out of control. "Stay behind me," he said, firmer now, and I hesitated, because part of me wanted to leave, to walk away and pretend none of this had happened. To go back to the version of my life where my father was simple and understandable, where graves were just graves and strangers did not stand around them like guardians. But another part of me, the part that had noticed the wrong initial on the tombstone, the part that remembered the lighter and the look on my father's face that night, that part needed answers more than it needed comfort. And I found myself staying exactly where I was, just slightly behind him, my eyes moving between the two men as they faced each other across a distance that felt much larger than a few yards. No one spoke at first, and that silence was louder than anything else, filled with history I could not see and decisions I did not understand. And then the other man's gaze shifted, landing on me with a sharpness that made my breath catch, like he was calculating something, measuring my presence against whatever plan he had brought with him, and I suddenly became aware of how exposed I was, how little I knew about any of this, about any of them, about my own father. "You brought her," the newcomer said, his voice smooth but edged with something I could not quite place, and I felt. The man in front of me straightened slightly, not defensive, but resolute. "She came on her own," he replied, and there was something in that distinction that mattered, something that told me I was not just an accident in this moment. I was a variable, a factor they had to account for, and that realization sent a chill down my spine, because if they had to account for me, it meant I mattered in a way I had never considered before. "She does not belong here," the other man continued, his eyes still on me, and I felt a flicker of anger push through the fear, because I had every right to be here. This was my father's grave, my past, my life. Even if I no longer understood it, and before I could stop myself, I stepped slightly to the side, enough to be seen clearly. "I think I do," I said, my voice shaking just enough to betray how unsteady I felt. But I did not back down, not this time, not when everything I thought I knew was unraveling right in front of me. And for a brief second, something like surprise crossed his face, subtle but real, and then it was gone, replaced by that same calculating calm, and the man in front of me exhaled quietly, almost like he had expected this, like he had been waiting to see if I would step forward or stay hidden, and the choice I had just made meant something more than I realized. "Your father made a decision years ago," he said, his voice low again, directed only at me now, even as the other man watched, "one that does not end with him." And the words settled deep, echoing in a place I could not ignore, because if that was true, if my father's choices were still unfolding now, still shaping this moment, then everything I had believed about his life, about our life, was incomplete, and I swallowed hard, my gaze drifting back to the tombstone, to the lighter resting there like proof of a story I had never been told. And I realized with a clarity that made my chest ache that I was not just visiting a grave anymore. I was standing at the edge of something much larger, something my father had kept hidden, and now it was waiting for me to understand it. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like both men were measuring something invisible between them, and I could not shake the feeling that whatever decision was about to be made had already been made long before I ever stepped into this cemetery. My eyes flicked between them, trying to read expressions that refused to give anything away, but it was the man beside me who spoke first, his voice calm but final. "This does not concern you anymore." And I felt the words land, like a line being drawn, not for the other man, but for me, as if he was trying to close a door that had already opened. "It concerns me," the other man replied smoothly, his gaze still locked on me, and I felt that same unsettling awareness again, like I was being seen as more than just a daughter visiting her father's grave, like I was part of something I had never agreed to. "She is not part of this," the man next to me said, and for a second something flickered in his tone, not doubt, not uncertainty, but something closer to restraint, like he was choosing his words carefully for my sake, and that alone told me this situation was far more complicated than I could grasp. "You are wrong," the other man said quietly, and then he took a step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate, the kind of movement that made the air shift again. "If she is his daughter, then she has always been part of it." And the statement hit me harder than anything else that had been said so far. Because it was not a suggestion, it was not a possibility, it was a fact delivered without hesitation, and I felt something inside me tighten, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as I fought the urge to step back, to create distance from a truth I was not ready to face. Stop talking about him like that, I said, the words coming out sharper than I expected, fueled by something deeper than confusion now, something protective, because whatever secrets my father had, he was still mine, still. The man who had raised me, who had shown up in quiet ways, who had never let me feel alone even when we had almost nothing, and I would not let strangers redefine him without a fight. The man beside me shifted slightly, just enough that I could feel the movement rather than see it, and I realized he was reacting to me, not them, not the situation, but me, like my words mattered in a way that changed the balance of the moment. You think you knew him? The other man said, his tone not mocking, not dismissive, but certain, and that certainty was worse than anything else, because it did not challenge me. It simply replaced my version of the truth with another one. But what you knew was the part he wanted you to see. And the words sank in slowly, painfully, because I had never questioned that before, never considered that the man I grew up with could have been only a piece of something larger, something hidden, something he chose to keep from me. And suddenly every memory felt different, every quiet moment, every unexplained absence, every time he changed the subject when I asked too many questions. It all rearranged itself into something I could not ignore anymore. I looked back at the tombstone again, at the initials that now felt wrong, incomplete, like they were hiding something in plain sight, and I felt my throat tighten. Then tell me, I said, my voice steadier now, stronger, because if this was happening, if this was real, then I was not going to stand here and pretend I did not deserve answers. Tell me who he really was. And for the first time, both men went still in a way that felt different from before, not tension, not calculation, but something closer to pause, like I had asked the one question that mattered more than any of the others. The man beside me exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly to the tombstone, to the lighter still resting there, and something in his expression changed, softened just enough to make it noticeable. He was a man who made a choice, he said finally, his voice lower now, more personal, like he was stepping into a memory rather than a conversation, a choice to protect someone he did not have to protect, and I felt my chest tighten again, because that sounded like him, that sounded exactly like the man I knew, and yet everything around me said there was more to it than that. From what? I asked quietly, and this time. It was not anger, not defiance, just the need to understand, to connect the pieces before they slipped away again. The other man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, like he already knew where this was going and did not approve. From a world he never wanted you to see. The man beside me answered, and those words settled over everything, heavier than the silence that followed, because suddenly it all made sense in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting, because it meant my father had not been hiding things out of distance or indifference, but out of protection, and terrifying because it meant that world still existed, still active, still close enough to reach me here, now, standing over his grave. And now she sees it, the other man said quietly, almost to himself, and I felt that same shift again, that awareness that whatever line had existed between my life and whatever this was had just been crossed, not by choice, but by truth. I looked down at the lighter one more time, then back at the man standing in front of me, the one who had been waiting, the one who spoke about my father like he knew him in ways I never could, and I realized something that made my breath catch. This was not just about the past, not just about who my father had been. This was about what he had left behind, and what was now being placed in front of me. What happens now? I asked, the question quiet but steady, and for a moment, no one answered, the air holding still again, like the world itself was waiting for the response. And then he looked at me, really looked at me, not as a stranger, not as a problem, but as something else entirely, something connected, something that mattered. Now, he said slowly, you decide whether you walk away from this. And his gaze flicked briefly toward the other man, then back to me, sharper now, more certain, or whether you find out why your father never could. The question hung in the air longer than I expected, stretching into something heavier than silence, because walking away suddenly felt like more than just leaving a cemetery. It felt like choosing ignorance, like choosing to keep believing a version of my life that no longer fit. And I could feel it in my chest, that quiet pull that had brought me here in the first place, the same pull that now refused to let me turn around and pretend none of this mattered. My eyes drifted back to the tombstone again, to the name that now felt incomplete, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before. If my father had hidden this much, then he had done it for a reason, not to deceive me, but to protect me. And that meant whatever he had kept from me was not small. It was not insignificant. It was something worth carrying alone. And now that weight was sitting here in front of me, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. If I walk away, I said slowly, my voice quieter now, but steadier than before. Does it all just disappear? And the man in front of me did not hesitate, did not soften the answer. No, he said simply. And that single word settled deeper than anything else he had said, because it confirmed what I already felt. This was not something I could ignore. Not anymore. Not after seeing this. Not after hearing what I had heard. The other man shifted slightly, his presence still sharp, still watchful. But there was something else there now too. Something that felt like calculation, like he was reassessing the situation based on my response. And I became aware again of how carefully every movement here was measured, how nothing happened without intention. You are being offered a choice most people never get, he said, his tone calm, but deliberate, to stay outside of something that will only complicate your life. And I understood what he was doing, offering me an exit, a clean break, a way to return to what I knew. But the way he said it made it sound like a warning, not a kindness, like he believed I would regret stepping further into this. And maybe he was right. Maybe everything about this was dangerous in ways I could not even begin to understand. But the idea of turning my back now, of leaving without knowing who my father really was, that felt worse, that felt like losing him all over again. And if I do not walk away? I asked, my eyes returning to the man beside me. Because for some reason his answer mattered more. His presence felt different, not safer exactly, but anchored in something that connected directly to my father. And he held my gaze without hesitation. Then you learn the truth, he said. And there was no drama in it, no exaggeration, just a quiet certainty that made the words feel heavier, more real. And you accept that some parts of your life were never what you thought they were. And I swallowed, because I already felt that happening. Already felt the shift in how I saw everything. And I knew there was no going back from that. Not fully, not completely. I glanced once more at the lighter, then down at the flowers still clutched in my hand, suddenly aware of how out of place they felt now, how small they seemed compared to everything else surrounding this moment. And without thinking, I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and the tombstone, my movement slow, deliberate, like I was crossing a line I could not uncross. The men in black did not stop me, did not move, but I could feel their attention shift, like they were acknowledging the decision before I even spoke it out loud. I placed the flowers down carefully at the base of the stone, right below the lighter, my fingers lingering for a second as I looked at the name again, really looked at it this time, and I realized something that made my breath catch. The letters were slightly different. Not wrong exactly, but altered, like a version of the truth instead of the whole of it, and a quiet understanding settled in. My father had not just lived a different life, he had been known by a different name, and that realization changed everything. He lied to me. I whispered, not angry, not even hurt, just processing, just trying to fit this new truth into the space where my old one had been. And the man beside me shook his head slightly. He protected you, he corrected. And I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting that settle, letting it reframe everything I thought I knew, because he was right. I could feel it. This was not about deception. It was about distance, about keeping me far enough away from something that could reach me even now. Even here, the sound of the car engine idling in the background felt louder suddenly, more present, and I opened my eyes again, turning slightly to look at the other man, who was still watching, still calculating. But now there was something else there too, something like acceptance, like he understood the choice I had just made even if he did not agree with it. Then you should leave, he said to me, not unkindly, but firmly, while you still can. And for a second, the simplicity of that suggestion almost pulled me, almost made me reconsider, because it would be easy, so easy to turn around, to walk back down the path, to get in my car and drive away from all of this. But I knew I would not. I knew I could not. Not anymore. Not after seeing this side of my father. Not after realizing how much he had carried without ever letting it touch me. And I lifted my chin slightly. meeting his gaze without backing down. "I am not leaving," I said, and the words felt solid the moment they left me, like they belonged to me in a way nothing else had in this moment. And beside me, I felt the man shift again, not surprised, not unsettled, but almost certain, like this was the outcome he had expected all along. "Then it begins," he said quietly, and something in the way he said it made my heart skip, not out of fear, but anticipation, because whatever this was, whatever I had just stepped into, it was not just about the past anymore. It was about what came next, and as I stood there between them, between the life I thought I knew and the truth I was only beginning to understand, I realized something that changed everything. I was no longer just visiting my father's grave. I was stepping into the life he had left behind, and this time, I was not going to be kept in the dark. The words settled around me like something final, like a door closing behind me without sound, and for the first time since I stepped into the cemetery, I felt it clearly, the shift, not outside, not in the men or the tension or the quiet hum of that waiting car, but inside me, something aligning, something choosing, and it did not feel like fear anymore. It felt like clarity, sharp and undeniable. I lifted my hand slowly and touched the edge of the tombstone, my fingers tracing the cold surface where his name was carved, or at least part of it, and I tried to reconcile the man I had known with the one they were describing, the one who made choices that echoed years after his death, the one who had been important enough for men like these to stand guard over his memory. And I realized something that made my chest tighten. I had never asked him who he used to be before I was born. I had never wondered what kind of life he lived before it became just the two of us. I had accepted the quiet version of him because it was the only one I ever saw. And now I was standing here realizing that version had been carefully chosen, carefully maintained, and maybe even carefully protected. "What kind of choice?" I asked softly, not looking at either of them, my eyes still on the stone, on the lighter resting above it like a marker of a truth I was only beginning to understand, and for a moment, no one answered. The air holding still again, like even this question carried weight, like it reached back into something neither of them took lightly. A choice to step between something dangerous and someone who could not defend themselves. The man beside me said finally, and his voice was different now, quieter, almost reflective, like he was not just telling me what happened, but remembering it, reliving it in a way that carried more than just facts. And I felt something twist in my chest, because that sounded exactly like my father. Not the secrets, not the hidden name, but the instinct, the way he always put himself between me and anything that might hurt me, the way he never hesitated when it came to protecting what mattered to him. And suddenly this version of him did not feel so distant. It felt like an extension of the man I knew, just in a world I had never seen. "And that someone was you," I said, turning my head slightly toward him. Because there was no one else it could be, no one else this would matter to in the way it clearly did. And he met my gaze without hesitation, no denial, no deflection, just a quiet confirmation that told me everything I needed to know, and I nodded once, slowly, letting that settle, because if my father had stepped into that world for him, if he had made a decision that connected their lives in that way, then whatever came next, whatever this all meant, it was not random, it was not coincidence, it was something that had been building long before I ever knew it existed. "And now you are here to repay that," I continued, my voice steadier now, more certain, because I was starting to see the shape of it, starting to understand the structure behind the moment, and again, he did not deny it. "I am here because I owe a debt that does not disappear just because time passes," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made the word debt feel heavier than money, heavier than obligation, like it was something personal, something carried, something that defined him in a way he did not take lightly. And I believed him, not because I knew him, but because I could see it, in the way he stood, in the way the others followed his lead without question, in the way he spoke about my father like he mattered, like he still mattered, and that alone changed how I saw him. Not safe, not harmless, but not empty either, not someone who forgot things that should not be forgotten. The other man exhaled quietly, a small sound that drew my attention back to him. And when I looked, I saw it. Not agreement, not approval, but understanding, like he recognized the weight of what was being said, even if he stood on the other side of it. "Debts like that do not end cleanly," he said, his voice calm, but edged with something more serious now. They pull people in, whether they want to be or not. And I felt that again, that subtle warning, that reminder that this was not just about honoring the past. It was about stepping into something active, something ongoing, something that could not be undone once it began. And I took a slow breath, letting it fill my lungs, letting it steady me, because I needed that clarity. I needed to know that whatever I was choosing it fully, not out of confusion, not out of pressure, but out of understanding. Even if that understanding was incomplete, then tell me everything, I said, my voice quiet but firm, and both of them went still again. That same pause, that same weight settling over the moment, because this time I was not just reacting, I was asking to be included, asking to step into something I knew could change everything. And for a second, I wondered if he would refuse, if he would decide I was still better off not knowing. But then he looked at me, really looked at me, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, but acknowledged, like he saw the decision I had made and accepted it. Not here, he said finally, glancing briefly toward the edge of the cemetery, toward the car that still waited, still silent, still part of something larger than this moment. This is not where that story begins. And the words sent a quiet chill through me, because if this was not the beginning, then everything I had experienced so far was only the edge of it, only the surface. And I felt that pull again, stronger now, not just curiosity, but something deeper, something tied to my father, to the life he had lived before me, to the choices he had made that were still unfolding now. And I nodded once, slowly, because I understood what he was saying, because I knew that if I stayed here, if I stood in this place any longer, I would not get the answers I was looking for. I would only get more questions, and I was done standing still, done waiting. I stepped back from the tombstone, my fingers brushing once more against the cold stone before I let them fall to my side. And for a brief moment, I let myself feel it, the loss, the memory, the version of him I had known. And then I let it settle, not disappear, not fade, but make room for what was coming next. And when I lifted my eyes again, I did not look at the ground. I did not look at the past. I looked forward, at him, at the path that was opening whether I had expected it or not. Then take me where it does, I said. And this time, there was no hesitation in my voice, no doubt, just the quiet certainty of someone who had already crossed the line and was no longer looking back. The moment the words left my mouth, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself acknowledged that there was no turning back now. And the man in front of me held my gaze for a second longer than before, as if measuring whether I truly understood what I had just agreed to. And maybe I did not completely, but I understood enough. Enough to know that walking away would haunt me more than stepping forward ever could. And that was all that mattered. He nodded once. A small movement, but final, like a decision being sealed. And then he turned slightly, his attention moving past me toward the men still standing in their quiet formation. We are leaving, he said, and no one questioned it. No one hesitated. They simply moved, the circle dissolving into motion so smooth it barely made a sound. And I realized then just how controlled everything about this world was. Nothing chaotic, nothing accidental. Even the way they stepped aside to create a clear path felt intentional, like this had been anticipated, like my choice had been expected all along. I glanced once more at the tombstone, at the lighter resting above my father's name, and something in my chest tightened, not regret, not doubt, but something quieter, something that felt like a goodbye to the version of him I had always known, because whatever came next would not fit inside that version anymore. And I let out a slow breath before turning away, following the man who now carried answers I needed more than anything else. The gravel crunched under my shoes as we moved toward the edge of the cemetery, each step feeling heavier than the last, not because I wanted to stop, but because I could feel the distance growing between me and everything familiar. The other man remained where he was, his presence still sharp even as we moved away, and I could feel his eyes on me, not hostile, not aggressive, but watching, like he was memorizing something, or maybe calculating what this would mean later. And that thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because it reminded me that this was not just about me and my father. It involved other people, other forces, things that extended beyond this moment in ways I could not yet see. The car came into full view as we approached, black, polished, The kind of vehicle that did not draw attention by being loud, but by being precise, intentional, like everything else I had seen so far. One of the men opened the rear door without a word, stepping back immediately after, and I hesitated for just a second, my hand hovering near the frame, because stepping into that car felt like crossing another line, a more permanent one, but then I remembered the lighter. The initials, the way my father had looked at it when he thought I was not paying attention, and I pushed that hesitation aside, sliding into the seat, the leather cool against my skin, the interior quiet in a way that felt insulated from the outside world, like whatever happened in here existed on a different level entirely. He followed a second later, the door closing with a soft, final sound that echoed louder than it should have, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence settling. Between us, not uncomfortable, but full, like there were too many things waiting to be said and neither of us had decided where to begin. The car started moving almost immediately, smooth and controlled, pulling away from the cemetery without any rush, without any sign that anything significant had just happened, and I found myself watching the world outside through the tinted window, the rows of headstones fading into the distance, the place where everything had changed becoming smaller with every passing second, and I realized something then, something that made my chest feel tight in a different way. I was leaving behind not just a place, but a version of myself, the one who had believed her life was simple, predictable, contained, and as that version faded from view, I turned my attention back to him, because if I was going to step into this, I needed to understand what I was stepping into. Start from the beginning, I said, my voice steady despite everything, because I needed structure. I needed something to hold on to as everything shifted around me. And he looked at me for a moment, considering, not whether to answer, but how. Like the way this story began mattered just as much as the story itself. The beginning is not where you think it is, he said. Finally, and there was something in his tone that told me this would not be simple, not linear, not something that fit neatly into the version of the world I was used to. Then start where it matters, I replied, because I was not going to let this become vague, not after everything that had already happened, not after the choice I had made. And something in his expression shifted slightly, not surprised, but acknowledging, like he understood that I was not going to sit quietly and accept partial answers. Your father was not just a mechanic, he said, and even though I already knew that, hearing it stated so directly still made something tighten in my chest, because it stripped away the last illusion I had been holding on to. He was someone who understood how things moved beneath the surface, he continued, his gaze steady, his voice controlled. Someone who knew how to navigate a world that most people never even realize exists. And I felt my mind trying to catch up, trying to place that version of him into the memories I had, trying to see the signs I had missed, the moments that did not fit, the silences that now felt intentional instead of empty. And you were part of that world, I said quietly, because it was no longer a question, not really, and he did not deny it. I was part of something he chose to step into, he corrected, and there was a difference there, one I was only beginning to understand, because it meant my father had not belonged to that world. By default, he had entered it, chosen it, and that choice was what connected everything now. Why? I asked, the word simple but heavy, because that was what mattered most. Not just what he did, but why he did it. And for the first time since we left the cemetery, he looked away, just briefly, like the answer was not easy, like it carried weight even for him. Because someone needed to, he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else, because it sounded exactly like my father. Not complicated, not self-serving, just necessary. And I leaned back slightly in the seat, letting that settle, letting the pieces begin to form something I could understand. Even if it was incomplete, even if it raised more questions than it answered. And as the city began to replace the quiet of the cemetery outside the window, buildings rising where headstones once stood, I realized that whatever came next, whatever this world really was, I was already inside it, and there was no going back to not knowing. The city moved past the window in a blur of glass and steel, familiar streets suddenly feeling different, like I was seeing them through a version of reality that had always existed but had never been visible to me before, and I sat there in the quiet of the car, trying to hold on to something solid, something that still made sense, but every time I reached for a memory of my father, it shifted slightly, not disappearing. not breaking, but expanding into something larger, something that no longer fit into the simple life I had built around it. And I realized that was the hardest part. Not that he had secrets, but that those secrets had been right there, woven into the life we shared, hidden in plain sight. He chose to step into it. I repeated quietly, more to myself than to him, because that word mattered. Choice. It meant this was not something that happened to him. It was something he decided, something he accepted, and that made it harder to understand and somehow easier at the same time, because it meant there was a reason, a purpose behind it. He did. The man beside me said, his voice steady, and I could feel his attention shift slightly toward me again, like he was tracking my thoughts without interrupting them. And once he did, there was no going back. And something in that echoed too closely to what I was feeling now, sitting here in this car, moving towards something I did not fully understand, knowing I had already passed the point where turning around would feel the same. I let out a slow breath and leaned my head back slightly against the seat, my eyes closing for just a second as I tried to piece it together, the quiet nights, the long hours, the way he always seemed aware of things before they happened, like he was listening to something I could not hear, and suddenly those details did not feel random anymore. They felt intentional, like small clues I had never known to look for. What was his real name? I asked, opening my eyes again, because if I was going to understand this, I needed to start with the truth, not the version I had been given. And for a moment, the man beside me did not answer, his gaze shifting forward, like he was considering the weight of that question, and I felt it too, because a name was not just a detail, it was identity, it was everything that defined who someone was. The name you knew was real, he said finally, and I frowned slightly, because that was not the answer I expected, but it was not the only one he used. He added, and that landed differently. Not a lie, not a replacement, but an addition, like my father had been more than one version of himself depending on where he stood, and I nodded slowly, letting that settle, because it fit. It made sense in a way that did not break what I remembered, but expanded it. Why did he keep me out of it? I asked next, my voice quieter now, because this was the part that mattered most, not what he did, but why he chose to keep me separate from it. And this time, the answer came faster, more certain. Because you were the one thing he refused to risk, and the words hit me in a place I was not prepared for, deeper than the revelations, deeper than the confusion, because it reframed everything. Every time he said no, every time he avoided a question, every time he kept something from me, it was not distance, it was protection, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not pain exactly, but something close to it, something that made it harder to breathe for a second. He could not control that world. The man continued, his voice steady but quieter now, like he was stepping into something more personal, but he could control how close it got to you. And I swallowed, because that made sense too, more sense than anything else, and it made the weight of what I was doing now feel heavier, because by stepping into this, I was crossing the line he had spent his life maintaining. I was moving towards something he had worked to keep away from me, and the realization did not stop me, but it did make me pause, made me consider the cost in a way I had not before. The car slowed slightly as we turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the main road fading behind us, and I glanced out the window again, noticing the change, the buildings becoming less crowded, more spaced out, like we were moving into a different part of the city, one that did not need to announce itself to be important. And you, I said, turning back to him, because there was still something I needed to understand, something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the cemetery. What are you in all of this? And the question felt more direct than anything I had asked before, because up until now, he had been the one with answers, the one guiding the conversation, but I needed to know who I was trusting, who I was following into this, and for the first time, there was a pause in him, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but something more deliberate, like he was choosing how much to give me and how much to hold back. I am someone your father chose to trust, he said, and I held his gaze, waiting, because that was not enough, not after everything, not after the choice I had made, and he seemed to recognize that, because a second later, he added, and someone who does not take that lightly. And I studied him for a moment, looking for something in his expression, something that would tell me whether those words meant what they sounded like, and I saw it, not in what he said, but in how he said it, in the way his voice did not shift, did not soften, did not try to convince me. It simply stated something he believed to be true, and for some reason, that mattered. That was enough, at least for now. The car came to a smooth stop a few seconds later, and I felt my pulse pick up slightly, not out of fear, but anticipation, because I knew this was it. The next step, the place where answers would start to take shape. The door beside me opened before I could reach for it. One of the men standing outside, his posture as precise as the others, and I hesitated for just a second, my hand resting against the seat as I looked out at the building in front of us. It did not look like anything extraordinary, just another part of the city, quiet, controlled, unremarkable in a way that now felt intentional, like the kind of place that did not need attention because it operated outside of it. And I realized something as I stepped out of the car, my feet hitting the pavement with a quiet finality. This was where the story changed, not just for my father, not just for the past, but for me, because whatever waited inside that building, whatever truths I was about to uncover, they were not just going to explain what had been, they were going to define what came next. And as I straightened slightly, lifting my eyes to meet his again, I knew there was only one way forward now, and I was already walking it. The building did not announce itself, and that was the first thing I noticed. No signs, no names, just clean lines of glass and steel that reflected the city back at itself like a mirror that gave nothing away. And as I stood there for a moment, I realized that was the point. This was not a place meant to be found. It was a place meant to be known, and only by the people who already understood what it was. The man beside me did not pause, did not look back. He simply moved forward, and I followed, my steps quieter now, more aware, like the ground itself carried weight I had not felt before. The doors opened before we reached them, not automatically, but deliberately, one of the men inside pulling them back with a precision that matched everything I had seen so far. And as I stepped through, the first thing that hit me was the silence, not empty, not still, but controlled, like every sound had been filtered, reduced to only what was necessary. The air felt cooler inside, the lighting soft but exact, illuminating everything without drawing attention to anything in particular. And I found myself slowing down, my eyes taking in the details without knowing what I was looking for. Polished floors, clean surfaces, nothing out of place, nothing personal. It felt less like a building and more like a system, something designed to function without distraction. Stay close, he said quietly, not turning. And I realized I had drifted half a step behind without meaning to. My attention pulled in too many directions at once. I adjusted my pace, matching his, grounding myself in the only constant I had in this moment, him. We moved through the space without interruption. People were there. I could feel them, see them in the periphery, but no one approached, no one questioned. Their awareness was subtle, controlled, like everything else. And it struck me then just how much influence it took to create something like this, a place where presence alone was enough to control movement, enough to establish order without a single raised voice. We reached an elevator at the end of the hall, the doors already open, waiting, and I stepped inside after him. The space enclosed but not tight, the kind of design that made you feel contained without feeling trapped. And as the doors closed, sealing us inside, I felt it again, that shift, that quiet awareness that I was moving deeper, further away from anything familiar. You are quiet, he said after a moment, his voice low, not questioning, just observing, and I let out a small breath, my eyes fixed on the faint reflection of myself in the polished surface of the door. I am listening, I replied, because that was the truth. I was trying to absorb everything, every detail, every word, every silence, because I had the sense that nothing here was accidental. Nothing was without meaning, and if I missed something, I might not get it back. He nodded slightly, like that answer made sense to him, like it was the right way to approach this, and the elevator moved smoothly, the motion almost unnoticeable except for the subtle shift in my balance. And I wondered how many times my father had been in places like this, how many doors he had walked through without me ever knowing, how many moments he had carried alone so that I would never have to. The doors opened again after what felt like too short a time, and the space beyond was different, quieter somehow, more contained. Like we had moved from the outer layer into something more central, more private. The hallway here was narrower, the lighting softer, and there were fewer people, but their presence felt stronger, more focused, like they were not just part of the environment, but part of something specific, something that required more attention. We stopped in front of a door that looked no different from the others. No markings, no indication of what was behind it. And he paused for a fraction of a second before reaching for the handle. Not hesitation, but intention. Like this moment mattered. Like what was behind that door was not just another step. It was a shift. Once you walk in, he said quietly, his hand resting on the handle, you do not get to pretend you do not know anymore. And the words settled over me, heavier than anything he had said so far, because they made it clear this was not just about answers. It was about acceptance, about stepping fully into a truth that would not let me go back to the version of my life I had before. And I felt my pulse pick up slightly, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and clear, because this was it, the line, the point where everything changed in a way that could not be undone. I lifted my chin slightly, meeting his gaze, and I did not hesitate, not this time. Then open it, I said, my voice steady, because I had already crossed that line the moment I chose to leave the cemetery. The moment I chose to follow him instead of turning back. And he held my gaze for 1 second longer, like he was confirming that, like he needed to see it. And then he turned the handle, the door opening smoothly, revealing a room that felt different the second I saw it. Not because of what was in it, but because of what it represented. This was not just a place. It was a center, a point where decisions were made, where information was held, where the truth I had been chasing was waiting, and I stepped inside without looking back, because there was nothing behind me anymore that I needed to return to, only answers in front of me that I needed to face. And as the door closed quietly behind us, sealing the space, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was not just my father's story anymore, it was mine too. The room did not feel large, but it felt important, like every inch of it had been designed with intention rather than comfort. And the moment I stepped fully inside, I noticed the difference immediately. The air was still, not empty, but contained, like sound itself had been reduced to only what mattered. There were no unnecessary details, no personal touches, just clean lines, dark wood, glass, and a single desk positioned in a way that made it clear where attention was meant to go. And I felt it then, that quiet pull, like this space was not just somewhere people worked. It was somewhere decisions were made, decisions that carried weight beyond these walls. I stopped a few feet in, my eyes scanning slowly, taking in everything without knowing exactly what I was looking for, because it was not about objects, it was about presence, about understanding what this place represented. And then I saw it. Not immediately, but as my gaze adjusted, a photograph placed carefully on the far side of the desk, not displayed, not framed for attention, just there, like it belonged. And something in my chest tightened before I even got close enough to see it clearly. Because I already knew, I already felt it. My feet moved without me thinking, each step quieter than the last, until I was standing in front of the desk, my breath catching slightly as my eyes focused. And there he was, my father, younger, not the version I knew, but not completely different either, his posture straighter, his expression sharper, but the same eyes, the same presence, just clearer, more defined, like a part of him I had never been allowed to see. And beside him stood the man who was now behind me, the one who had brought me here, both of them looking directly at the camera, not smiling, not posing, just present, like they understood exactly what that moment meant. And I felt something shift inside me, something quiet but undeniable, because this was proof, not words, not explanations, but something real, something that connected everything I had been told to something I could actually see. When was this taken? I asked, my voice softer than I expected. Because speaking too loudly in this room felt wrong somehow, like it would break something that needed to remain intact. Years ago, he replied from behind me, his tone steady, and I could hear the distance in it. Not emotional distance, but time, like he was reaching back to a place that was still clear to him but no longer present. I swallowed, my eyes still fixed on the image, trying to reconcile it with the man I had known, the quiet evenings, the simple routines, the version of him that never hinted at any of this. And I realized something that made my chest feel tight again. He had never looked at me like that, not because he did not care, but because he had chosen not to bring that part of himself into our life. He had separated it completely, kept it contained, and now I was standing here, looking directly at the version of him he had kept hidden. He trusted you, I said slowly, because that was the only conclusion that made sense. And behind me, there was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. He did. He answered, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just a quiet certainty that made the statement feel heavier than anything else he had said. I nodded slightly, letting that settle, because trust like that was not given lightly, not by someone who lived the kind of life I was beginning to understand, and it made everything that followed, everything happening now, feel less like coincidence and more like continuation, like something that had been set in motion long before I was aware of it. I reached out slowly, my fingers hovering just above the edge of the desk, not touching the photograph. Not yet, because it felt like crossing another line, like acknowledging something that could not be undone, and I hesitated for just a second before letting my hand rest lightly against the surface, grounding myself in the moment, in the reality of what I was seeing. Why did he never tell me? I asked, not looking back at him, because I was not sure I was ready to see his expression when he answered, and for a moment, there was no response, just that same controlled silence that seemed to define everything here. And then, quietly, because he wanted you to have a life that was yours, he said, and the words settled over me, simple, direct, but layered with meaning, because they explained everything and nothing at the same time. They told me why, but they did not erase the distance, the years of not knowing, the moments I could have understood him differently if I had just known. And I felt that conflict rise up, not anger, not exactly, but something close, something that struggled to accept that being protected also meant being kept in the dark. I turned then, finally facing him, my eyes searching his for something. I did not know what exactly, but something that would help me make sense of it. And now, I said, my voice steady despite everything. You are telling me because you think I should be part of it. And he held my gaze, not avoiding, not deflecting, just present. I am telling you because you already are, he replied, and that landed differently. Not as an invitation, not as a suggestion, but as a fact, something that existed regardless of what I wanted or chose, and I felt that again, that shift, that realization that this was not just about learning, it was about accepting something that had already begun, something that had been waiting for me to see it. And I glanced back at the photograph one more time, at the version of my father that now felt both familiar and completely new, and I understood then. This was not about becoming someone else. This was about understanding who he had been, and what that meant for who I was now. And as I stood there in that quiet room, with the past laid out in front of me, and the future waiting just beyond it, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. I was not just uncovering his story, I was stepping into it. The weight of his words did not fade. It settled, deeper with every second, like something anchoring itself inside me whether I was ready for it or not. And I stood there in front of that photograph, my eyes moving between the man I had known all my life and the version of him that had existed just beyond my reach, trying to reconcile them into one person, trying to understand how both could be true at the same time. And the more I looked, the more I realized they were not separate, not divided. They were layered, one built carefully over the other, one chosen, one concealed, and I felt something shift in the way I remembered him, not replacing the past, but adding to it, giving it depth I had never considered before. He knew this day might come, I said quietly, not because I was sure, but because it felt true, because nothing about what I had seen so far suggested randomness. Everything felt prepared, anticipated, like pieces set in place long before I arrived, and behind me, I heard a small movement, the faint sound of him stepping closer, not invading, not interrupting, just present. He hoped it would not. He replied, and that difference mattered. Not expectation, but possibility, not planning for me to be here, but preparing in case I ever was. And that realization settled differently, softer somehow, like it carried care instead of inevitability. I let out a slow breath, my fingers still resting lightly on the edge of the desk, grounding myself as everything else shifted. So this, I gestured slightly toward the room, the building, the space that now felt like more than just a location. This is what he was part of, and I did not know if that question could even be answered simply, but I needed something, some way to frame what I was stepping into. And for a moment, he did not respond, not because he could not, but because he was choosing how to explain something that did not fit into simple words. This is a place where decisions are made that most people never see, he said finally, his voice steady, controlled, but quieter than before, like he understood the weight of what he was sharing. A place where outcomes are shaped long before they reach the surface. And I felt my mind trying to grasp that, trying to fit it into something I could understand. But it did not come easily, because this was not a job, not a role. It was something broader, something that influenced without being visible. And I swallowed, because that meant my father had lived in that space, had operated in a world that affected things far beyond what I had ever known. And I had never seen it, never felt it, not directly. And that realization made me pause, because it meant he had been very, very careful. And now I am. Here, I said, not as a question, but as a statement, because there was no denying it anymore, no stepping back from it. And he did not correct me, did not soften it. Yes, he said simply, and that one word carried more weight than any explanation. Could. I turned slightly, leaning back against the desk now, needing the support, needing something solid behind me as I faced him fully, because this was no longer about my father alone. This was about what came next, about what his choices meant for me now. Then tell me what that means, I said, my voice steady despite the tension in my chest, because I needed clarity. I needed to understand what being here actually changed. And his gaze held mine, direct, unflinching, like he was not going to hide anything from me now, not after everything. It means you know enough that you cannot unknow it, he said, and I felt that land immediately, because it was true. I could already feel it, the way my perspective had shifted, the way I could not go back to seeing the world the way I had before. And it means there are people who will assume you matter, he continued. And that made something tighten in my chest, because it was not just about knowledge, it was about perception, about how others would see me now, based on what I was connected to, even if I do not. I said quietly, because that distinction felt important, because I had not asked for this, had not chosen it in the way my father had. And he shook his head slightly, not dismissing me, but correcting something I had not fully understood. You matter because he did, he said. And there it was again, that connection, that thread that tied everything together, not my actions, not my choices, but his. And I felt the weight of that settle in a new way, not as pressure, but as reality. Because whether I accepted it or not, it was already true. I looked away for a moment, my gaze drifting back to the photograph, to the two of them standing side by side. And I wondered what my father would think of this, of me standing here, of me asking these questions, of me stepping into something he had worked so hard to keep me away from. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of uncertainty, not doubt about being here, but about what he would have wanted, whether this was something he would have accepted or something he would have tried to stop. He would not have wanted this, I said quietly, voicing the thought before I could stop it, and the room seemed to hold that statement for a moment, like it carried more weight than the others. And then, calmly, no, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to argue, just agreement. And that surprised me, because I expected resistance, expected him to justify it, to tell me it did not matter, but instead he acknowledged it, accepted it, and that made the next part matter even more. But he knew I would not ignore it if it happened, he added, and I felt my gaze snap back to him, because that changed everything, because it meant my father had not just protected me, he had understood me, had anticipated the possibility that if I ever found out, I would not turn away, and that realization hit deeper than anything else, because it meant this moment, this choice, was not entirely separate from him. It was something he had seen coming, something he had prepared for in his own way. And I let out a slow breath, feeling something settle inside me, something steadier, less chaotic, because for the first time since this all began, I did not feel like I was stepping into something alone. I felt like I was stepping into something he had already walked, something he had left behind not just as a secret, but as a path. And I straightened slightly, my hand lifting from the desk as I faced him fully again, the hesitation gone, replaced by something quieter, something more certain. Then do not hold anything back, I said, my voice firm now, because if I was going to be here, if I was going to understand this, I needed the full truth, not pieces, not fragments, everything. And he studied me for a moment, not questioning, not doubting, just confirming. And then he nodded once, a small movement, but final, like another decision being made. Then we begin with what your father left behind, he said. And something in the way he said it made my pulse pick up, not out of fear, but anticipation, because whatever he had left, it was not just information. It was something meant to be found, something meant to be understood. And as I stood there in that quiet room, with the past unfolding in front of me and the future waiting just beyond it, I realized that this was not just about learning who my father had been. It was about discovering what he had set in motion and why it had led me here. He moved toward the desk without urgency, but every step felt intentional, like he was following a path he had walked before, and I watched closely, my attention narrowing to every detail, because I understood now that nothing here was random, nothing was without meaning. He reached the far side of the desk and paused for a brief moment, his hand resting lightly against the surface as if acknowledging something unseen, something remembered. And then he opened a drawer, not quickly, not casually, but with a precision that made the action feel significant, like this was not just a drawer, but a threshold, and I felt my breath slow without realizing it, my focus sharpening as he reached inside and pulled out a small, rectangular object, dark, unmarked, simple in a way that made it stand out even more in a room where everything was controlled. He left this with me, he said, placing it gently on the desk between us, and I stepped closer without thinking, drawn to it, because whatever this was, it was not just something he owned. It was something my father had chosen to leave behind, something meant to be found, and that alone made it matter more than anything else in the room. I looked down at it, my reflection faintly visible on its surface, distorted just enough to feel unfamiliar, and I felt a quiet tension build in my chest, not fear, not hesitation, but anticipation, because this was it, the first real piece of him that I had never known. What is it? I asked, my voice lower now, almost careful, like speaking too loudly might break whatever this moment was holding together. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting from me to the object and back again, like he was measuring something, not whether to tell me, but how much I was ready to understand. It is a key, he said finally, and I frowned slightly, because it did not look like one, no ridges, no shape I recognized, just a smooth, dark surface that gave nothing away. Not to a place, he added. And that made me look up at him. Again, because that changed the meaning entirely. Then to what? I asked, and this time, there was no pause, no hesitation. To what he wanted you to know, if you ever found your way here. And the words settled into me slowly, because they confirmed something I had already begun to feel. This was not an accident, not a coincidence. This was intentional, something he had prepared, not for me to discover, but for me to choose to discover. And that distinction mattered, because it meant he had trusted me, trusted that if I ever reached this point, I would be ready to see what he had left behind. I reached out slowly, my fingers hovering just above the object, and for a second, I hesitated, because touching it felt like crossing another line, like moving from understanding into action. But then I remembered the photograph, the way he had looked in it, the version of him that had been waiting just beyond my reach. And I let my hand lower, my fingers brushing against the surface, cool, smooth, real, and something shifted inside me the moment I made contact. Not physically, not something I could explain, but a quiet recognition, like this was meant to happen, like this had always been part of the path. How does it work? I asked, my voice steady now, because whatever hesitation I had was gone, replaced by something clearer, something more focused, and he gestured slightly toward the far wall, where I had not noticed anything before, but now, as I looked, I saw it, a panel, seamless, almost invisible, built into the surface in a way that only revealed itself when you knew where to look, and I felt a small shift in my awareness, like the room itself was unfolding, revealing layers I had not seen when I first walked in. There are things your father did not trust to memory, he said quietly, and that made sense, because memory could fade, could be lost, could be taken, but something like this, something physical, something hidden, that was different, that was deliberate. I stepped toward the wall, the object still in my hand, my pulse steady but stronger now, because this was no longer just about understanding. This was about discovery, about uncovering something that had been waiting, and as I reached the panel, I paused for just a second. My reflection faintly visible again in the surface, and I barely recognized the person looking back at me. Not because I had changed, but because I was seeing myself differently. No longer just someone who had lost a father, but someone who was about to understand who he really was, and what that meant. I lifted the object slightly, holding it near the panel, and for a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretching just enough to make me question, to make me wonder if I was missing something. But then there was a soft shift, a quiet click that barely registered as sound, and the surface in front of me changed, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath it, and I felt my breath catch as the panel slid open, revealing a space behind it, not large, not overwhelming, but precise, contained, and inside. There were items, carefully placed, organized, not random, not scattered, but chosen, and I stepped closer, my eyes moving over them, taking in the details, documents, objects, things that clearly meant something, things that carried weight, and I realized then that this was not just a collection. It was a message, something my father had left behind not just to be found, but to be understood, and I felt that shift again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about guessing, no longer about piecing together fragments. This was about seeing the truth directly, and as I reached forward, my hand moving toward the first item, I knew that whatever I touched, whatever I uncovered next, would not just explain his past, it would define my future. My fingers hovered for just a second before I finally touched the first item, and the moment I did, everything else seemed to fall away, the room, the silence, even the man behind me, all of it fading into the background as my focus narrowed completely to what was in front of me. It was a folder, simple, unmarked, but the weight of it in my hand felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just paper, like it carried decisions, consequences, pieces of a life I had never been allowed to see. I opened it slowly, not rushing, not forcing, because something about this demanded respect, demanded patience, and the first page inside stopped me immediately, not because it was complicated, but because it was clear, precise, structured in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, names, dates, locations, all organized with a level of detail that felt deliberate, intentional. And as my eyes moved over the lines, I felt something shift again, deeper this time, because this was not a story, not a memory. This was evidence, proof of a life that existed parallel to the one I had known. And I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly on the folder as I tried to process it. He documented everything, I said quietly, more to myself than to him, because that was what it looked like, not random notes, not scattered thoughts, but a record, something meant to be understood later, something meant to be followed. And behind me, his voice came, steady, confirming only what mattered. And that distinction hit immediately, because it meant this was not everything. This was curated, chosen, and that made every line more important, more intentional. I turned the page carefully, my movements slower now, more aware, and the next section was different, less structured, more personal, notes written in a way that felt closer to him, not just information, but thought, reasoning, decisions explained in a way that made them feel real, and I felt my chest tighten as I read, because I could hear him in it, not literally, but in the way the words were chosen, in the way the sentences were built. It felt like him, like the version of him I knew had found a way into this hidden part of his life, and that made it harder, not easier, because it connected everything. It made the distance between those two versions of him disappear, and I realized then that he had never really been two different people. He had been one person living two realities, and I had only ever seen one of them. He was trying to protect something, I said slowly, my eyes still scanning the page, because that was the pattern, the common thread in everything I was reading, not control, not power, but protection, and that word settled differently now, heavier, more complex, because it was no longer just about me. It extended beyond that, into something larger, something that affected more than just one life. He said behind me, and I could feel the certainty in it, not opinion, not interpretation, but fact, and I nodded slightly, letting that settle, because it aligned with everything I knew about him. Even now, even with all of this, that part had not changed. I turned another page, and this time, I stopped completely, my breath catching slightly as my eyes focused on a single line, written differently from the rest, not part of the structure, not part of the record, but something separate, something intentional, and I read it again, slower this time, making sure I understood it correctly, making sure I was not misinterpreting what I was seeing, and then I felt it, that shift, that realization that settled deeper than anything before. This is not just a record, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, because now I understood, now I saw it clearly. It is instructions, and the word hung there, heavier than anything else, because it changed everything. It meant this was not just about understanding the past, it was about continuing. Something, about following something that had already been set in motion, and behind me, there was no immediate response, just that same controlled silence. But it felt different now, less like hesitation and more like confirmation, like he had been waiting for me to see it on my own, to reach that conclusion without being told. And I slowly lifted my head, turning slightly to look at him, my expression searching, not for answers this time, but for confirmation, and he gave it with a single, small nod. And that was enough, more than enough, because it meant I was not imagining it. I was not overthinking it. This was real. This was exactly what it seemed to be, and I looked back down at the page, at the words that now felt different, not just information, but direction, and I felt my pulse pick up, not out of fear, but awareness, because this was the moment everything shifted from discovery to decision, from understanding to action, and I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was what he had left behind, not just answers, but a path, something meant to be followed, something that required choice, and I stood there for a second longer, the folder open in my hands, the weight of it no longer just physical, but something more, something that carried responsibility, and I took a slow breath, letting it fill my lungs, steadying myself, because I knew what came next would not be passive, it would not be simple, it would require me to decide whether I was willing to step fully into what he had started, and as I closed the folder gently, my fingers resting against its surface for just a moment, I understood something with complete clarity. I was no longer just uncovering his story. I was being asked to continue it. The silence after that realization did not feel empty. It felt full, like everything in the room was waiting, not for him, not for anything external, but for me, and I stood there with the folder in my hands, feeling its weight settle into something more than just paper, something that carried intention, something that carried trust, and I understood now that this was never about uncovering a secret for the sake of knowing. It was about being given a choice, the same kind of choice my father had made, not in the same circumstances, not in the same world exactly, but in the same spirit, to step forward or to step away, and for a moment, I let myself feel the full weight of that, not rushing past it, not ignoring it, because this mattered. This was the point where everything I had learned turned into something real, something that would shape what came next. I looked down at the folder again, my fingers tightening slightly against its edge, and I could almost hear his voice in the back of my mind, not saying anything specific, just that familiar presence, the quiet certainty he always carried, and it grounded me in a way nothing else could, because even now, even in a world I had never known, that part of him still reached me, still guided me, and I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was not about becoming him. It was about understanding why he chose what he chose, and deciding what that meant for me. I lifted my head slowly, turning toward the man who had brought me here, who had stood beside me through every step of this without pushing, without forcing, just allowing me to see, and I met his gaze directly. No hesitation, no uncertainty left. If I walk away now, I said, my voice steady, because I needed to say it out loud, needed to hear it. Everything in here stays exactly as it is. And he held my gaze, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening. And if I stay, I continued, the words clearer now, more defined. Then this becomes my responsibility. And there was no fear in it anymore, no confusion, just understanding. And after a moment, he nodded once, that same small, deliberate motion that had marked every important shift since this began. Yes, he said, and that was all. No elaboration, no pressure, just confirmation. And that was enough, because the choice was already made. It had been made the moment I stepped into the cemetery and did not turn away, The moment I followed him instead of leaving, the moment I opened that panel and chose to see what was hidden, all of it had been leading here, to this exact point, and I felt it settle, solid and certain, like something locking into place inside me. I looked back down at the folder one last time, then gently placed it on the desk, not because I was rejecting it, but because I understood that this was not something I needed to hold in my hands to carry with me. It was already part of me now, already shaping how I saw everything, and I let my hand rest there for a second, grounding myself in that understanding, before stepping back, my posture straightening, my focus sharpening, because this was no longer about hesitation. It was about moving forward. Then we do it right, I said, my voice calm but firm. Because if I was going to step into this, if I was going to continue what he had started, it would not be halfway. It would not be uncertain. It would be deliberate, intentional, the way he had done everything. And for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, subtle, but real, not surprise, not relief, but recognition, like he saw the decision fully now, like he understood that I was not just here to learn, I was here to act, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt less like agreement and more like acknowledgement. We will, he said, and the words carried weight, not just promise, but commitment, and I nodded once, because that was all that needed to be said. The rest would come in time. In action, in the choices that followed. I turned then, my gaze moving across the room one more time, taking in the space that had shifted from unfamiliar to something else entirely, something that now felt connected to me in a way I could not ignore. The photograph, the desk, the hidden panel, all of it part of a story that was no longer just his, and I realized something as I took a step toward the door, something that settled deep and steady inside me. I was not stepping into the dark, I was stepping into something he had already illuminated, something he had prepared, not to trap me, but to guide me, and that changed everything, because it meant I was not alone in this, not really, even now, even after everything. He was still here in the choices he had made, in the path he had left behind, and as the door opened and I moved forward without hesitation, I understood something with complete clarity. I did not just inherit his past, I inherited his purpose, and this time, I was ready to carry it.